Hey, with Patrick Findaro here, co-founder and managing partner at Visa Franchise. Excited to have on Chris Hoehn-Saric, who's the CEO and co-founder at inSpring. Chris, thanks so much for joining today.
Thanks, Patrick. It's great to be here.
So, Chris, you spent a lot of your career in the international student space, developing programs, and we'll talk a bit about that. But you've changed paths, co-founded a company inSpring, where you're helping technologists, nurses, and today I'd like to really dive into the nursing aspect and why international students, there's hundreds of thousands of them, should really consider nursing as a path to securing a high paying job in the US.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I had the great fortune of working in a business over the last decade that supports and recruits international students to university around the country called Shorelight. My co-founder and I had spent a decade in that business working alongside universities, recruiters, and students and families, understanding what drives their behavior to come get an education here. And as part of that experience, we learn more and more about the opportunity to work following their degree, using the F1 visa, being able to avail themselves of OPT, and the opportunity economically that it provides their families to really set themselves up for multi-generational wealth. And what we started to learn about was the sort of friction points between the employment world here in the US that sits as this incredible opportunity, but the disconnect with the education system, not just for international students, but certainly especially for international students. And so our view between the technology vertical, which we serve students who have advanced degrees in computer science and data science and in related software engineering fields, we help finalize that last mile into the employment sphere for them and help companies adjust to all the challenges and complexities of both the OPT process as well as other visa categories to ensure appropriate work visas. But on the nursing side, we saw a really tremendous opportunity that very few students knew about. And it's something that, as we spent a decade in the space, we always scratched our heads as to why there weren't more international student nurses coming to study here. And it's fewer than 6,000 out of the million students here. It's a rounding
How many
error.
are studying like anthropology and will never use that degree? There's got to be
That's
at
right.
least 6,000.
It's almost it's an accident that currently students enter into that path. And so part of what we do at inSpring is we solve for all the different points of friction as to why that's the case. But more importantly, we're out to evangelize why it's such a great opportunity for international students today.
And yeah, so tell me, how many in that decade that you were growing Shorelight with your colleagues, how many students did you help find their dream university and get the F1 visa?
Sure. I'd say over the course of the 10 years or so, the Shorelight's helped 25 plus thousand students around the country. It's the largest aggregator of international students in the US, representing 80 universities, I think now. It's a really tremendous business, and it's one that I think has made it a lot more accessible for all universities and all students around the country.
And while you were there at Shorelight, what were some of the pinpoints that led you to create inSpring? Because you had all these students that you had so much data on, and you knew that there were these getting to the university is one thing, but what's the next step, I guess?
Yeah, I think what we've learned is that the same challenges that universities face in approaching international students, the fact that they come with slightly different credentials, the fact that they have different regulations that apply to them, the fact that everything about their sort of access point and marketing and recruitment of them is just a little bit different. And when they're 5% of the overall enrollment of the university, which is the average in the country, it's a bit of a rounding error for their operating structure. And it's kind of the same narrative within the employment space, where hospitals and technology employers they're looking at this and going, yeah, we need bodies to serve our hospitals. We need nurses. We need qualified, licensed nurses. And 99% of the nurses coming to them look a certain way. And to figure out all the complexity around EB3 work visas, student work rights, all that sounds like a big headache, honestly. And so we realize is there needs to be somebody to solve these pain points for the employers, and we need somebody to help solve it for the candidates, because it's an overwhelming set of things that need to happen correctly to avail yourself of this opportunity.
And I was looking at some of the data that the Department of Labor produces on employer-sponsored, like the EB2 and EB3 category, and it seems like a growing trend where people are applying directly for those categories or applying off a student visa, where before it was like, it's still H-1B's the lion's share, but these other options to getting a green card are becoming much more popular than in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we looked at what verticals or fields we would serve with inSpring, it wasn't just because we liked healthcare. It's because we looked at the BLS data and all the trends that look at everything from reports saying there are 900,000 nurse shortage in 2027 to the honestly the relatively high pay rates that you can get as a nurse, essentially zero unemployment. The average salary is $89,000 a year. It's very tied to a set of strict licensure that you can achieve. And we looked at it and said, this is just one of the most tremendous opportunities from a career perspective for anybody, not just one that's meaningful and helps our economy and helps our public health. And what's amazing is that the government actually recognizes this and is hard coded into law. I believe it's almost 20 years ago now, what's called a Schedule A occupation, which there are only two. There's physical therapists and nurses, which are by dint of law considered the exceptions to the EB3 policies around assessing whether or not there's domestic supply. The government has determined very rightfully that there are not enough nurses in the United States. We need foreign supply. And if you are qualified, which is a big complicated question as to what that means, you can come through the EB3 path and the skilled visa category, and you don't have to go through a complex justification as to why.
And what are we talking about? Saving like 6-9 months more in terms of the process that someone else would be going through for the EB3 green card?
Compared to a non-nurse, is that your question?
Non-nurse.
Yeah, it's not just about the time. Yes, absolutely the time. It's also the certainty that if you're coming in through another path, you can certainly come into the skilled EB3 path, but it requires the employer to take on a tremendous amount of legal and financial work to justify the Department of Labor that they've tried everything they can, not dissimilarly to the H-1B challenge. And it's not structured in a way that makes that an appealing process for either the employer or the employee.
And you mentioned the median wage, but what I've met too are these traveling nurses where the numbers are crazy, like 200K, 300K, and they maybe have a 40-hour, 50-hour job, or they're doing a few 12-hour shifts, but then they're traveling and making serious money going to rural hospitals and wherever the highest demand is.
Yeah, I think the opportunity as an individual, once you establish yourself as a nurse and you have some years under your belt, they're tremendous, both to become a traveler, but also to work your way up into more advanced fields where earning a master's degree or doctoral degree can easily put you into the six figures, even over $200,000 a year. And it's one of the rare, I think, paths where you can get an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a doctoral degree, and you can just sort of track very clearly the ROI, which is tremendous at each level. So we think it's a tremendous career, and it's an easy access point to longer term stability in the labor market here. And what the challenge that we've seen in that space is, there are a number of companies that have created really wonderful businesses finding foreign educated nurses, bringing them to the US on a staffing model, and bringing them through as a foreign educated nurse. And that path works, and it's something that we are certainly open to helping candidates with as well. But where we see the tremendous opportunity is that path to be a foreign educated nurse requires one to go through a fairly complicated and rigorous assessment as to whether or not your overseas credentials are equivalent to those in the United States. And we have a fairly high bar here. Hospitals and the government have set up a structure to make sure that if you come in as a foreign educated nurse, that your credential is equivalent to that of the one from the nurse who got educated down the street. And the challenge is most countries don't have education systems or nurse paths, nurse roles that are identical to that in the United States. And our view is that's over time going to develop, and there are countries like the Philippines who've done an incredible job at this. But most candidates in most countries won't have themselves that opportunity. So we can educate them here in the US, get them acclimated to the academic life here, understand what being a nurse in the US means, the high level of autonomy that represents, and ultimately get them educated here, where their credential is, of course, equivalent because it is the credential here. They can get their clinicals done here in American hospital settings. They're practicing in English, and ultimately they're getting their license and they're passing their NCLEX here in the US.
So I guess there's a lot of different, I guess, personas of people that you can help. But thinking about that nurse in Mexico, speaks English pretty well, has an equivalent, I guess, of a bachelor's. What would they be doing in the United States? What's the timeline cost look like for that Mexican nurse that has already been practicing in Mexico, but it's opening to getting a master's degree and continuing on in the US?
Yeah, absolutely. So each case is a little bit different. So some of these cases, as you know, they could come over right away and start working, provided that we can find a hospital that would employ them. I'm sure we would. We're a bilingual nurse who's got work experience and an equivalent credential. The challenge is always, well, is that bachelor's degree equivalent to our bachelor's degree? And if the answer to that is yes, that person can be put on some sort of path or even brought into a master's degree program right away where they could potentially work day one. So that's certainly a path we can work with them on. Alternatively, they could be coming in and having to do a top-up program of some sort to earn another credential here to give everybody confidence that they've got their credential. So there's many paths.
And do you hold their hand throughout the whole process? Like they're always working with inSpring from the time they select the school, certificate program, get the job?
Absolutely. So we work with them from that first conversation to the point where they've gotten full sponsorship. They're in place. We've helped them adjust to wherever their employer is. And I think you've sort of indicated, I think some of the biggest challenges in this whole process is you're moving to another country. You're walking through multiple points of the F1 visa process, the education system here, adjusting to life in the academic world, getting a job on your OPT, and then should you choose, if you want to, continue pursuing the life here and the career here, change of status and what that entails.
And how about the international students that are like first year, and don't know what they should be, pursuing? And how about for the international students already on an F1, any advice for them or their parents that might be listening?
If they're listening, we'd love to have the conversation about their career options, whatever they might be. I think a lot of students, not just international, but a lot of students in the US don't really know what their career path is going to be when they're in that first or second year of education. And I think for international students, those who are taking out a fair amount of financial risk to be here, whether that's through a loan or through family funds, starting to think about high ROI career paths at the earliest point is great. And getting onto the nursing track in this case, which can be done earlier, can put you into this position where you're earning probably what I would consider the clearest path to making over 1.5 times the median household income in the US as a 23-year-old.
Yeah, I mean, there's not many options that can really set you up where it's that clear that you can make that much. As well as what I love about the path is just the flexibility and the optionality that you have after you pass through the clinicals and different stages, where you can live anywhere in the US. There's always going to be a physician for you.
That's right. There's not a hospital in the country that doesn't need nurses. There's not a hospital that's saying in 5 years we're going to be all set. This problem grows worse and worse every year, and it's one that, to your point, is incredibly flexible in both in the environment that you work in. Doesn't have to be a hospital, and also, I think really importantly, it provides a path for future career opportunity. It's not you become an RN and you're done. You have many options within, even just staying within the RN track, different floors, different hospital settings, different acuity settings. You can become a traveler. And I think it provides tons of optionality, to your point. And I think one thing that's probably the hardest part is it is a hard profession. What I would say is it is for people who want to do something that is challenging but rewarding, and it requires a lot of grit. And I think that's what we've seen with international students broadly. They work really hard and they have a lot of grit.
Yeah, I think we've had out of the 20 plus interns, I think 80 to 90% have been international students, as they have that drive and they're willing to put in the work, and they're just found much more curious than some of the other students that we've had intern with us.
Absolutely. And I think they provide something that's, not something that should be underappreciated. The hospitals and the healthcare system here is not just in dire need of more qualified people. We need a more diverse workforce. We have a diverse patient pool. We have a diverse population. It's becoming more diverse over time. And traditionally, the nurse profession has not been particularly diverse. And so adding to both cultural and ethnic diversity, but also linguistic diversity, is really important for hospitals everywhere around the country.
And Chris, the programs that inSpring supports with, or the type of clients that you work with, these students, do they have to come from money? Or do they have to have set aside $30K to do this, or what are the financial requirements, and are there any scholarships? I'd love to hear.
Yeah, it depends on the program and the path for each candidate. It's going to be a little bit different. We typically look at candidates have a little bit of funds just to make sure that they're able to adjust, be able to pay for meals and things here. But more importantly, we are able to provide loans with loan partners to these educational programs who can help write the majority of the cost for them.
That's huge.
And it's part of our value add is making sure that the programs that we work with are ones that have loans available, have scholarships available sometimes. And I think where we really hang our hat is making sure that they can get a high paying job.
You get the job. So you're on the hook to make sure that they can pay that loan off, and it's not going to be 10 years that they're still making loan payments.
That's right. And I think where we're really seeing just this sort of the thesis play out, which is candidates who have strong academic backgrounds in their home country from the sciences, who are ready and who want to be part of the healthcare workforce, broadly speaking. I think they see this as an opportunity to really transform their lives.
Yeah, I mean, there's got to just be such a pent-up demand for this. I know when I was out in El Salvador on a surf trip, my driver was saying that people would sell their house, $15K, pay Coyote $7,500, cross the border, and then pay the rest to the Coyote. So they're paying $15K to legally move to the US, where there's plenty of options where you do it legally, you're legally here, and you're set up for a serious career that's a high earning career, and you're not constantly worrying about how you're going to finally get a permanent green card, how you're going to finally get a U.S. citizenship. There's a pretty defined path, as we've talked about today with nursing.
That's right. And I think, just because you kind of mentioned the global mobility nature of this, one of the really, I think, interesting points that's come up in the last few years is what are the ethical standards one has to abide by when you're thinking about taking people from primarily developing countries and moving them into the developing world in the healthcare space, especially. And one aspect of this is we're typically looking at candidates who are not necessarily frontline providers in their home country. We're not taking nurses who are working in one of these countries and moving them here. That's not exactly the candidate profile we typically look at. But I think the really, really powerful part of what we're doing and trying to make sure that we're doing things ethically is, number one, the candidate, when we're finished with preparing them and making sure they get educated and employed, is fully employed by the hospital. We're not garnishing their wages. That is their job.
They get the benefits of the hospital, 401k plan, all that good stuff.
Absolutely, and I think it's really important in the way we've set up the business that's just critical. The other aspect is, because these are such high-paying careers, the ability to remit money back home and to actually support communities is tremendous. And there have been estimates that I've seen. I think I read a book that mentioned about 10% of the Philippines' GDP was coming from primarily nurse remission funds coming back. And when you think about an $85,000 check, you could write back 10% of that, and that's the per capita income
higher than a median family in the Philippines. So that's there's right. There's so much more money flowing through that economy.
Yeah, so I think it's something we have our eye on, and certainly want to be behaving the best we can.
Really right.
And also, I think it's just an opportunity for truly multi-generational wealth that expands globally. And
what have you seen, what operators have you studied? Because I'm sure you studied this for years, where you're like, we're not going to do it like this. We need to treat the candidate this way, and we don't like how this operation's kind of. I guess, what are some things that people should be paying attention to not fall into some school or work situation that isn't going to yield their American dream?
Yeah, I think with all of these, not just in the education sphere, but even to the more sort of difficult parts that you've just talked about with your example from El Salvador, where I think people are taking advantage and things can get pretty bad. So I think one of the things is making sure that whoever you're working with and any of the paths that you're going down are reputable, that they've got sort of public profiles that can be vetted, that what they're doing is sort of above board in every way. And I think a lot of it comes down to, you'll hear horror stories about people charging $5,000 and I'll promise you something and disappearing. That's the kind of stuff we stay away from. So we don't charge candidates big dollars to participate up front. We're really in it for the long run with everybody, and where we tied our economic model to their ultimate placement.
We've helped thousands of clients at Visa franchise. Sadly, some came to us after they were scammed, and they were usually scammed by the same nationality. So I can think of French Canadians screwing over other French Canadians, Mexicans screwing over other Mexicans, Argentines screwing over other Argentines. Language, shared culture, and it's sad that these things happen, but people definitely need to be on guard. And thanks for sharing some of those signs that people should be looking out for.
Absolutely.
And I guess compared to for the other career paths that traditionally rely on the H-1B, I know friends that have been on H-1Bs and Miami Super International that people just get stuck at a certain salary where the company dangles the green card, but they're just keeping them on the H-1B for years and limiting their advancement, their pay. But with nursing, with the competition, there's going to be someone will sponsor your green card pretty fast. So they're not going to be subjected to that type of behavior compared to some other industries, I imagine.
Yeah, I think the profession is one that's in incredible demand, and in the last few years, which has been tremendously difficult for nurses. There's also been, there's been some difficulties in retaining nurses within hospital systems and within the broader medical system in general. And there's been an acceleration of retirements that have compounded to create a lot of pressure on the profession. And one of the positive outcomes is over the last year or two, salaries have really been increasing. And a lot of both the unions as well as just general market behavior has pushed salaries up. And it's made it so that these are really, really secure positions. And they're also positions that are starting to get a much more appropriate market rate. So I think, as you said, you hear horror stories about people who are dangled the carrot forever. And I think that's something we certainly want to avoid. And that's part of the process we want to go through in getting people their employer sponsorship immediately.
And I forget if I mentioned this, but I spoke to one franchisee of a pretty big senior care chain. They have over 200 franchises across the U.S. He has 300 employees. Some of them are clinical work. Some are just caregivers. But his retention rate, like over a 2-year period, for the foreign workers, the immigrants, is like 95%. Where for an American, he was saying like after a month, like half drop off. So like from an employer perspective, this is an amazing opportunity where you get someone that's really wants to be there and they're going to give it their all and they're loyal to you. They're going to be with you and grow with you.
It's a really important point. And I think the most recent estimates came out in April around the cost for place a nurse. It was something like $50,000, just the cost to replace. Wow. And hospitals see about a 25% attrition in year one, and that understates the new graduate attrition rate, which I think in Florida they had a report that was about 50% attrition from the hospital because people jump around quickly, and because of those both the hard kind of immigration path to things that are in process that prevent people from wanting to move around. But I think more importantly, behaviorally, international students and candidates tend to be really dedicated to establishing themselves, establishing job security, establishing roots in a community. And I think 90% retention over 2 years in any position in the healthcare field would be considered extraordinary.
Yeah, it makes it so much easier running your business is if you don't have to be constantly. I mean, you always want to be recruiting talent, but knowing that you can count on talent, cultivate it, promote them, and not be worrying of them leaving. Chris, we have a bunch of questions coming in. Maybe we could go through a few from Ezekiel. Are there specific visa requirements for international students seeking high-paying nursing jobs in the U.S.?
Yes. So there are two paths, as I think I briefly mentioned. One is to be a foreign educated nurse, and there's a whole path on the EB3 to come in on. And that has its own set of requirements to get approved by a group called CGFNS. There's a series of sort of standard bearers that have to be checked through, and it can take a fairly long time to do all of that. To the international student side, there's really a two-part process. The first is coming in as an F1 student and trying to get an education here. And that's really the principal place where we see original candidates. Do you want to get educated as a nurse here? After that, you're working on your student visa and you're maintaining your student visa and on what's called OPT. And if you choose, we can help work with you to file change of status to one of many different categories, but the primary one being the EB3. And so that would be the visa category that they would be converting into.
Thanks for that, Chris. We have a question from Tomas. So we touched briefly on, but hi, are there scholarships available for international students?
Yes, so there are scholarships, and more importantly, there's student lending available for the students that we work with. The biggest challenge with really sort of looking more broadly outside of what we're doing is that typically nursing schools have not recruited international students heavily. And as I was saying, less than 0.5% or so of the international students are studying nursing, and there's a reason for that. And a lot of that comes down to scholarship availability. A lot of that comes down to loan availability. And a lot of it comes down to the way those programs are structured. We work with programs that are 18 months or less to earn your degree.
Wow.
And so part of what we're doing is trying to compress the time, primarily 12-month programs where you can earn your whole program in that period, which is all about speed to ROI.
And then from Emily, can Mexican nurses get a TN visa?
Yes, absolutely. And so we're currently working with some Mexican nurses who have a TN visa that can act as part of their work rights here. That, again, lots of things that they can convert into over time and many options. But for folks who are able to get the TN visa, there's many, many more options.
And then also from Emily, what are the requirements to get into a U.S. nursing institution for an international student?
It depends on which track you're going into, but the principal things are, one, English, making sure that people have a level of English, typically between an IELTS of a 5.0 and a 6.5 is sort of the threshold line for most programs. Well, they'll admit you to either direct or conditional entry. And the second piece is, depending on which track you want to go down, where we are focusing is on what are called accelerated bachelors in nursing. And those typically require a bachelor's degree that's already been completed. So you've actually already completed your undergrad program in really anything, preferably in the health sciences, but can be anything. And we can then put you through a series of prerequisite courses that will qualify you for these accelerated 12-month programs.
And then from Nicole Henderson, hello, what are the steps international students take to overcome potential barriers when applying for jobs in the U.S.?
So that's really what we're all about at inSpring. So this is our entire purpose for being, is working with international students to help them bridge the last mile between education and employment. A lot of it has to do with preparation, making sure that you're fully prepared for what not just the job market and the application process is like, but what are some of the challenges that come with being an international student? What are the questions that might be posed by employers? So we work with employers to break down a lot of those barriers for our candidates. We want to make sure that we're only working with employers who not just value what international students can bring to them, but are also making sure that they're putting in place the policies that are necessary to onboard them appropriately.
Speaking to international students, the apprentices that we've had in the past, it just seems they don't get much guidance at all. It's kind of, they're paying sometimes $150K, $200K for a US degree. And the university is kind of like, good luck and you're off on your way. And I just don't know how that is going to be sustainable long term, but it's great that you're able to jump in and really fill that gap where you would kind of expect it somewhat from a university, but time and time again, they're not providing that support, specifically for the international students, which sometimes are small and minority of the student population too.
It's absolutely right. And I think there's a lot of reasons why universities don't have the capacity to take that on. And I think it's also more of a symptom of a broader employment market issue of being in a sort of a broken system. And we see more on the tech side of the world and on the nursing side, but candidates who are saying I've applied to hundreds of jobs and heard back nothing, and talking to employers who go, yeah, I opened a position and we got 5,000 applicants, and we're trying to vet through which are qualified, which will yield. It's sort of an open and yet broken system, and I think international students just get it doubly bad.
And a question from Muriel: are there any particular states or regions in the USA that offer better high-paying nursing jobs?
So the great thing about nursing is that it's a career that in literally every market is a high paying position, and typically wages somewhat adjust to the respective sort of cost of living. And so in a state like Kansas, the average salary might be $72,000, $75,000, which is
Which isn't
below
bad living in Kansas. Making
when
that.
you're living in Kansas. $72,000 goes a really long way. And so we're looking at places where we know that the income to tuition ratios are really strong, so that we're providing that kind of high ROI side. But it is a highly mobile career. There's the license of a nurse can transport across lots of states, and there's a whole complexity to that. But it's one of the more mobile licenses that you can get. And again, demand being what it is, there isn't a market in the country you couldn't move to and find a job.
Are there any countries where it's easier? Like I think for doctors coming from Canada, it's a little easier going to the US. Are there any countries where it's easier kind of bringing your nursing license degree to the US?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly the Philippines has built a reputation for quality, and over a generation has done this. I think, broadly speaking, obviously the US and Canada just tend to have lots of interrelations and very open border policies around things. And then, of course, anybody in the NAFTA TN side has more visa options. But from an academic standpoint, I think most countries find that the definition of nurse and nurse education not quite matching up to the US. And that goes for even places like the UK or Australia, where we tend to have even friction points. And just as a side note, as I'm thinking about it, one thing that is not totally fully appreciated, I think, by many international candidates is, we've sort of said it over and over again, but it's a very high paying position here. It's a very well respected position here.
Yeah.
And even in other countries like the UK, a nurse in the UK makes maybe half of what they make in the US. And so it's a really unique situation here, where we have created the value for nurses that they, I think, really do deserve.
And I know, compared to many Latin American countries, it's like 10x in terms of what they're getting paid in Colombia and Chile compared to the numbers you shared with us today. I mean, and also serious upward mobility, where I've heard in some of these countries, even in Europe, you enter into the system and you're kind of at that place for a very long time.
Yeah.
We're just going to answer a couple more questions from Emily here. How does retrogression impact nurses too? And I believe this is in reference to the EB3 green card category.
Yeah, it's a great question. So right now there is a retrogression on EB3s being processed right now, and we expect that to change, I think, in the near future. But number one thing for the candidates we deal with is they're first and foremost on their F1 visa. So they're working on their F1 visa for a full year after they graduate. There's also many other paths for nurses, not just going into the EB3 category. There's paths through the H1B category. There's paths through the EB category, EB2 category. So we work with the candidates to make sure we're availing ourselves of whatever options they want to and can try to go through. But it's something we monitor, and it's something that needs to be monitored, and hopefully it's something that our government can recognize as a big challenge, and something that we should really invest more heavily on preventing in the future.
And also realistically, like if you're in your 20s, early 30s and you're single, like there's a chance that you marry an American, or your spouse that's also foreign is on some other visa category, and that gives you more time. So it is really a unique situation. It's great that inSpring, Chris, and your colleagues can help people and kind of curate whatever the path that best suits them is. Chris, any concluding thoughts? We went through a lot today, a lot of great questions that came in.
It was really a pleasure to be here with you, Patrick. And I think what we're really here to do is help people understand the profession, understand what their options are, help people where we can. And we think it's something that can be a real asset to families overseas and to our healthcare system. So we're really excited to be doing something that can be really meaningful for so many different stakeholders.
What's the best way for international students, whether they're already in the U.S. or thinking about pursuing a nursing career in the U.S., to enter into contact with you, Chris, or your colleagues at inSpring?
We can go to our website, inspringcareers.com, and there's a form they can fill out, and somebody on our team will get in touch with them.
Perfect. Chris, thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks so much.